To start off explaining Encounter 3, you just gotta kind of get there and see it. The videos do it plenty of justice, but this is how the mechanics play out. When you get to the middle, you got this fancy little pillar here. You can see these clearly divided lines on the ground, but they're not preventing you from going anywhere. And you have your rally flag. Now, there's a couple of ways to denote this, but the community seems to be following a pattern, so we're going to do the same. Even though all of the areas technically have stairs, the way we denote stairs is when you drop in, this is the one with the rally flag. So we kind of equate this as our true north, and we just call it stairs. Over here, however, there's going to be some of those dog statues like the Leviathan, and it makes it pretty easy to call this one dog or dogs, etc. Whereas on the void side, it's visibly fucking purple. So if you're having a hard time acclimatizing to the fact that this one is called stairs, this one is called dog, and this one's called void, I don't really have any advice for you. But the encounter kind of flows as follows. Alright, our drawings changed a little bit. We're going to start our encounter. In order to do this, you need to break up into teams of 2. 3 teams of 2 to be exact, in case you're bad at math. Now, it's very easy to keep your same teams of 2 throughout this entire raid, so I'm going to recommend that you do that. So you start at your rally flag, 2 players go over here, 2 players go over here, 2 players go over there. Now that we see we have 2 players indicated by blue dots in each quadrant, those could be your left, mid, and right teammates from before, we can kind of explain what's going on here. So in each area, there's basically the same idea. You have some stairs that kind of follow this pattern, so like, the bottom third of a stop sign in all 3 directions, right? And you can follow along. They each have some kind of a blockage, like a half a statue or something in these corners that kind of give you some cover to work, etc. You've got these big boxes and clumps of boxes that you can get on top of that are kind of in line behind these from where things are going to be shooting at you up here. So you can really work that cover to stay away from enemies that want to hurt you. These red lines that used to be black dotted lines are now walls keeping you in your respective area. So it's important that 2 people are in each area when the encounter starts. You start it by shooting the boss up here. So if everyone's not where they're supposed to be and someone shoots the boss, you have to wipe. Well, how do you do that? These little red zigzags are some hive flames that even though you're blocked into these areas, you can stand in the hive flames and wipe. Now, as with every other encounter thus far, and every other encounter to follow, you are going to have a witch's crystal. Now the next round is going to happen in this area or room also, so let's go ahead and lay out some rules right now. For one, in this encounter, everyone's going to have to utilize a witch's crystal for something, and in the next encounter you're going to be broken up into teams of 2 again in the same locations. So, in the sense that everything in this encounter is going to work clockwise, we are going to work clockwise. So the 2 players at stairs, even though they're going to be facing this way or this way sometimes, have to understand that if the room rotates clockwise, they are going to go to this rightmost witch's crystal and utilize it. Same for these guys at dog. They're going to be facing this way towards the stairs at some times. Other times they're going to be facing down from the stairs. They need to take into account that theirs is here, just like Void needs to take into account that theirs is here. So from wherever direction you're standing, keep in mind the locations of your teammates and just understand that Void's plate is going to be this witch's crystal, Stairs' plate is going to be this witch's crystal, and Dog's plate is going to be this witch's crystal. This encounter gets a little weird, so I'm going to explain the mechanic and then I'm going to show you a mock version of it. So what happens here is, at some point, when we start the encounter and everyone's in their respective areas, somebody is going to get a mini boss, a bather with 2 of those butcher's axes, and you can't damage him, you just have to avoid him. Remember I said these boxes up here are a great place to stay off the ground? Since you can't hurt him and you just gotta run away, it's pretty easy to drop like a warlock rift up there, not a well, a rift, and just kinda hang out and avoid him. Now, let's say for example, whoever gets their boss, one of these areas is going to get a boss. One of these areas immediately to the right of that area is going to get the Witch's Blessing buff circle. And then one area to the right of that, or to the left of where the boss spawns, is going to get absolutely nothing. So for this, I'm going to show you how it should play out according to teams, and I'm going to denote them from where the starting location is. So let's say, for example, Stairs gets the boss. You can see with my handy dandy drawing skills, I've added that Stairs will get their boss up here. So in that sense, this does not happen always. In this instance, Stairs is going to get the boss. Following clockwise to the right, the players at Dog are going to get a buff circle, a witch's blessing if you will. And Void, as I expressed earlier, is going to get jack shit. What do we do about this? Well, in an easier effort to kind of convey what's about to happen, I'm going to refer to the team at Stairs who has the boss as Team 1. I'm going to refer to the team at Dog who has no boss but a witch's blessing as the Team 2. I'm going to refer to Void as Team 3 because let's face it, they're not useful until the very end. So this encounter plays out about as complicated as you make it. But in reality, what happens here is Team 1, with their boss, just has to maintain the fact that they don't have any buffs. They have to stay on these containers. They have to stay away from the boss. They can kill all the ads together. Sometimes an ogre will spawn, knights, witches, what have you. You literally just kill whatever moves. Do not get caught using your heavy for this. Use your outbreaks, use your shotguns, use whatever secondaries you want. Different players use different strats. I'm a fan thus far of the sword heavy strat, which we'll talk about when we get there. So save your heavy for when you're damaging the boss, or if you want to commit to outbreaks, that's all you, dog. But Team 1 avoids their boss, stays up high, stays alive, within the confines of their walled off area. Team 2, however, has a little bit of a complicated task. So what happens here is, and this goes quick, I can't exaggerate that. This goes quick if everyone's doing what they're supposed to do. The team at Dog, one player is going to receive their buff for ease of use. In this encounter, just like in the first encounter, let's say that everyone who received a buff in encounter 1 and assumably encounter 2 is going to be your buff receiver for your side. This makes it a little easier, so you just kind of know that he's your guy. Alright, so your guy at Dog, one of them hops in the buff circle. He receives his buff. Well, what's going on at this time? Team 1 is avoiding the boss and killing ads. Team 2, one player is getting the buff, one player is not. The buffed player is going to be able to damage different ads than the unbuffed player. And you're wondering, well, how does that work for the other two areas? Well, on Team 2, it's specific to them because they have a buff. On Team 3, who has no boss, no buff yet, is literally just going to be able to damage all the same ads, just like Stairs is going to be able to damage all the same ads. It only applies to the area that has an active buff or has the ability to have an active buff. Don't ask me why this is. I don't know. That's just how it is. So, Stairs is avoiding their boss. You guys got a buff player and an unbuffed player. Team 3 over here's got nothing. So while they got the boss, you got a buff, no buff. They got nothing. Everybody's going to kill their ads until an ogre spawns, and when the ogre spawns, you kill the ogre. That activates your witch's vessels. Now this is where it gets a little tricky. Just a little tricky. Now stay with me on this because I'm going to be doing some changing as we go. Assuming all our ogres are dead in 1, 2, 3 different areas. The players who got the buff, Team 2, both players, the guy with the blessing, the guy without the blessing, are going to come to their witch's crystal. And one, preferably the buff getter from 1 and 2 encounters, is going to come down here and join them in the circle. So you'll notice I got 2 blue dots and a green dot. So that's our original blessed player, a buff player, and 2 unbuffed players. And then it progresses as follows. Now our team layout looks a little different. If you'll notice down here in our witch's crystal, everyone shot together, just like in the first encounter. Buff players, unbuffed players shoot together while they're all standing inside the circle. And the buff's going to trade. So notice our 2 blue dots became green dots, and our green dot became a blue dot. Well, then what happens? Everybody's still trapped across this red line, but they can still use the witch's crystal. Well, this player, who was unbuffed, is now the buffed player for this team, which is Team 3. And the unbuffed player and the buff player here just swapped roles, So the team makeup is still the same. You got 2 people over here avoiding their boss. You got your original buffed and unbuffed players. They just crisscrossed roles. And in doing so, they gave a buff to Team 3, who now has a buffed and an unbuffed player. And then the round proceeds again. You're going to get some thralls and some witches, etc. You kill them. You kill your ogre that spawns, either a buffed or an unbuffed, depending on if you've got the buff or not, and you just kind of slay it. And when you do, it activates the witch's crystal again. Now this is where it gets a little complicated, guys, but you just stay with me. I'm going to make it pretty crystal. Alright, some craziness goes down at this point. Everyone kills their ogre. And then when these witches' crystals activate, this magic happens. So, in our theoretical situation, the boss is here, the buff started here, we transferred the buff here. Now, when we activate the second round of crystals, this imaginary wall between Team 2, wherever they may have been, and Team 3, wherever they may have been, to their immediate right, breaks down. And now all 4 players who are running out of buff after killing their ogres, like, you gotta hustle. All 4 players, buffed and unbuffed, are going to go stand on their half of this witch's crystal that they can occupy. And both players from Team 1, who have been babysitting the boss the entire round, just killing a couple of ads, everyone's going to go stand in this witch's crystal. And the buff players and unbuffed players are going to shoot it at the same time, like that hot scissor in action. And when they do, it turns into this. So now we have another furtherance of the whole walls going away mechanic, as we see everybody that was in this witch's crystal, both of our unbuffed players and our buffed players and our 2 unbuffed players from the stairs. They've all met up right here at the same location. And this invisible line marked by the red dots here that used to keep them separated goes away, as well as every other line that used to keep them from meeting up. And as you'll notice, we started with 2 buffed players and 4 unbuffed players. If you're following the math, we had a buffed player and an unbuffed player come here, swap out and become a buffed and an unbuffed in reverse. So if you were buffed to start with in this encounter, you didn't have the buff in the second wave. Whoever had the buff first from this encounter would then go here with everyone, and everyone that started with a buff is going to get it back, and the 2 people from stairs are going to end with a buff. So in essence, if you follow the math, you can project who's going to be buffed and unbuffed if you just apply this rotation to whatever direction. So if the boss was here, it would go the same. Team 1 players are going to end buffed because they start with the boss, they get the buff last. Team 2 players, whoever starts with the buff, is going to finish with the buff. Team 3, whoever starts with the buff after being past the buff is going to lose it. So, in essence, if you assign the players numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 5 and 6 are going to have it regardless, 1 is going to have it regardless, and 3 and 4, while it seems weird, 4 is going to get it and 3 isn't, because they start with it, they're going to lose it at the end. So that leaves you player 2, who was the second player on the dog team, or team 2, who got the buff second and lost it in the third change off, and team 3's players 3 and 4, 3 is going to get it first and lose it, and 4 is going to pick it up. So players 2 and players 3 in that scenario are going to be your unbuffed players. What is easiest to remember for damaging the boss is that you have 4, presumably if you've done this right, 4 buffed players, no matter who they were. If you can't remember the math of players 1, 4, 5, and 6, cool. They're going to be buffed. The 2 unbuffed players, players 2 and 3, if you can remember that, they're unbuffed. To damage the boss, he's going to start moving around, right? So there's no sense in saying where this is going to happen. He's just going to start moving around. What you got to remember is a couple of things. He's going to have an overshield wherever he goes. With this overshield, the only way to take it down is to have a buffed player and an unbuffed player melee him. If you're following along with the math, you have 4 unbuffed players. So you have 4 opportunities to lower this shield and rail him with some damage. What is easiest is if your unbuffed player, since there's only 2 of them, remains the same throughout. So he is always going to be the unbuffed meleeer. And then everyone else takes a number. I'm going to be first buffed punch. I'm going to be second buff punch. I'm going to be third punch, fourth punch. The reason I assign numbers to these players in the clockwise rotation is because if you can remember this, it's super, super easy. I'm not going to push it on you because the community's not doing this, but if they learned, it would make things a lot easier, like reading the walls in Last Wish or doing CAP and Scourge, just assigning numbers. So, if you have the boss in Team 1, you ain't nothing. When it comes to Team 2, they have the buff, so we start numbering there. So if the boss is at stairs, or if the boss is at dog, the boss is at void, immediately to their right, wherever they are in the rotation, immediately to their right is the buff. Those are players 1 and 2. The first player to receive the buff is going to be one of the buff players at the very end. The second player isn't. So the second player, player number 2 in the rotation, wherever they are, wherever the buff starts, it's very easy to just say they are going to be the non-buffed punch for all 4 of the buffed, unbuffed punch combos. So when the boss comes down, it's damage phase. Everyone stays away except for the buffed and the unbuffed punch. Now, if you want to assign numbered rolls further, let's say, for example, the buff started at dog like it did in our mock scenario. If there's a player 1 who's buffed, player 2 isn't, they're your first combo, and then you have 3 and 4. 3 has lost their buff and 4 has picked it up. Then player 4 would be your second buff punch, and then you have 5 and 6 who are at stairs who have had no buffs or any buff transferences until the very end. That would make 5 number 3 and 6 number 4. If you can't remember that and you're just assigning punches in the heat of the moment, that's fine, but sometimes you can get screwed up. The only thing you have to remember is that wherever the boss lands, whether you're running sword strat or your overdrive strat, doesn't matter, whoever's not doing the punch, stay far enough away from him, because when his shield explodes, you're going to lose the buff. So your buffed puncher is going to become an unbuffed player. They can still damage the boss, but they will not be able to keep punching him to lower the shield. So when they punch, they lose their buff, and he kind of explodes a little bit. So everyone else needs to be far enough back from him. So if he's planted up like right here, you need to be kind of over here. You know, you want to put some distance between you and him for your damage phase. And then once his shield goes down, if you're running sword strat, then you just run up and everybody starts wailing on him. If you're out of sword ammo, because you were one of the first players to jump on him, and you want to kind of sit back and just hit him with your Outbreak or your Wendigo or your Mountaintop or whatever, cool. Just keep some distance, because if you don't, you're going to lose a buff on players that haven't punched yet, and you're going to lose a round in your damage phase. And if it starts back up, you know, if you don't one phase him, which can happen, it's not a sure thing. Everybody just goes back to their respective areas, and you start it all over again from the beginning. 2 players up here by stairs, your 2 players over here by dog, your 2 players over here at void. Now what happens from there is, hush dog. What happens from there is things could arrange themselves differently. So just because stairs started with the boss in our encounter, and we got all the way through our damage phase and we didn't kill him, that boss, that deception, can move to another area, but the mechanics progress the same. So the boss is going to be in one phase, the buff is going to be immediately to the right. So if we said, hey, the boss starts at dog this time, well, the buff's going to be at void, and stairs is going to get a free round to just kill as many ads as they want. As long as you understand when it's time to transfer the buff, the people who start with the boss don't do it until the end. The people who are immediately to their right, one person picks up the buff and one person doesn't. You kill everything, then 2 people from the team with the buff, 1 person from the team without the buff to their immediate right. They come to the same Witch's Crystal. These 2 people are going to swap their buffs around. This person's going to receive a buff from the buffed player here. They go back to their respective teams. You now have 2 buffed and 2 unbuffed players. And at the end, all 4 of these players end up here after another round of ogres. And these 2 players who were babysitting their boss end up over here. And they all trade the buff together for a total of 4 buffed and 2 unbuffed. If you can't follow the math in saying who's going to be the punches and who isn't, that's fine. It's not going to be held against you by any means. But knowing ahead of time who could potentially be doing what, regardless of where the boss or where the buff spawns, is pretty invaluable. And after you take his health to 0, you get some free shit. Usually very powerful shit.